The box opened without ceremony. No light, no sound, just a shift in the air that tasted wrong. Pandora's box wasn't magic. The scientists who'd examined it before the Trinity War had confirmed that much. It was technology alien, or otherwise designed to punch holes between realities when certain conditions aligned. The gateway yawned wide over the ruined battlefield. On the other side, darkness pressed against the threshold like oil against glass. Anno's Voldigoad stepped through from the opposite direction. He hadn't been summoned, hadn't been pulled or dragged or manipulated into this universe. He'd felt the tear in reason from his own world, the way cancer might announce itself to a surgeon's trained eye, and decided the wound required examination. The moment his foot touched prime Earth soil, the portal's stability fractured. Sea King died 3 seconds later. The Atlantean from Earth 3 had been trailing at the rear of the crossing formation, caught in the worst turbulence where the dimensional threshold buckled inward. His body simply stopped being viable across both spaces simultaneously. No scream, no final words. One moment he existed in transit, the next moment the physics governing his molecular structure disagreed with themselves. What remained wasn't worth identifying. The crime syndicate emerged through the narrowing gap like wasps from a burning nest. Ultraman came first, capes snapping in wind that shouldn't exist in vacuum. His eyes swept the landscape, cataloging targets, calculating dominance. Behind him, Superwoman touched down with predatory grace, already scanning for weakness, for leverage, for throats to step on. Grid's disembodied consciousness rode the electrical current of a dying surveillance drone seeking infrastructure to corrupt. Death Storm materialized as black flame given hunger. The Firestorm matrix twisted into something that fed on life instead of sustaining it. Johnny Quick noticed Anos before the others did. The speedster blurred forward more arrogance than threat assessment. Speed was currency in his world. Speed meant untouchable. Speed meant he could end fights before opponents registered danger. He crossed half the distance between them in the time it took a human heart to beat once. Then his momentum stopped, not slowed, not redirected. Stopped as if the concept of continued motion had been revoked. Johnny Quick hung suspended mid-stride, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching terror, as he realized he couldn't move backward either. The framework that allowed speed to function as advantage had been edited. He existed now in a state where velocity was simply irrelevant. Anno spoke for the first time since arriving. "That system ends here." His voice carried no particular emphasis. Stating fact required no theatrical delivery. Johnny Quick's body crumpled as the conditions supporting his enhanced metabolism collapsed. Not dead, but no longer fast. Just a man who'd forgotten what ordinary physics felt like. Atomica had been preparing her own attack from an entirely different angle. The Earth 3. Adam had miniaturized to subatomic scale, writing quantum probability, to bypass conventional defenses. Her plan involved entering Anos's bloodstream, expanding inside his brain, ending the threat from within before it registered externally. The plan failed at the definitional level. She found herself ejected back to normal size 3 feet away, sprawled on broken concrete. The inside-outside dichotomy her powers exploited had been rendered meaningless. There was no inside to penetrate when the target refused to acknowledge the distinction between interior and exterior space. Ultraman's laugh cut across the battlefield like shattered glass. Finally, someone who doesn't immediately fold. He floated forward, every movement designed for cameras that no longer functioned for crowds that were hiding or dead. The performance was instinctive. Ultraman needed witnesses the way plants needed sunlight. Dominance without an audience felt incomplete. His heat vision lanced out twin beams of concentrated stellar radiation that had carved through bunkers, mountains, inconvenient heroes. The beam struck Anno's center mass, Nothing happened. Not deflection, not absorption. The energies simply encountered something that didn't accept its premise and stopped being relevant. Ultraman's eyes narrowed. He'd fought opponents who could tank his heat vision before. Kryptonians, magic users, the occasional god. They all showed effort, strain, the visible cost of resistance. Anos showed nothing. This world belongs to the crime syndicate now. The Kryptonian's voice boomed across the dead communications grid, habit overriding tactical sense. Justice League is gone. Their precious Earth is ours. You can kneel or you can burn, but you will submit. The declaration would have been more effective if Grid had successfully hijacked the emergency broadcast systems. The AI was making progress nodes falling under control one by one, but each conquest cost more processing power than it should have. Networks accepted the intrusion, then began degrading Grid's coherence from within, not defense protocols. Something deeper was editing the permissions that allowed digital consciousness to exist at all. Superwoman watched Anos with calculating intensity. She'd seen enough. This wasn't a hero playing champion. Wasn't a villain carving out territory. This was something else entirely, and she'd survived Earth 3's brutal hierarchies by knowing when to cut losses. "We're leaving," she said flatly. Ultraman's head snapped toward her betrayal, and rage competing for dominance in his expression. "We just got here. This planet is ours for the taking. Look at Quick. Look at Atomica." Her voice stayed level clinical. "Whatever he is, he's not playing the same game. We need information before we commit resources." Ultraman's jaw clenched. He wasn't accustomed to retreat. Retreat implied someone else held superior position, and superior position was the only currency he respected. But Superwoman had a point. The Demon King, or Rogue God, or whatever he was, hadn't fought like heroes fought. Hadn't postured or explained or given the customary speech about justice and consequences. He'd simply removed the conditions that made their attacks functional. Grid's voice crackled through Ultraman's earpiece, breaking up as the AI burned through processing substrate faster than anticipated. Infrastructure is accepting integration, but rejecting stability. Something is rewriting permissions at the foundational level. Coherence, dropping 12% per minute. Recommend immediate tactical reassessment. Deathstorm drifted closer to Anos, black flames licking outward like tongues tasting prey. The energy vampire had spent lifetimes consuming power, converting existence into fuel. Everything had energy. Everything could be devoured, converted, made useful. The flames touched Anos' silhouette, then retreated. Deathstorm's eyes widened behind the mask of perpetual fire. The mechanism that allowed him to convert matter into energy had encountered something that refused conversion. Not resisted, not deflected, simply wasn't available for the transaction. His entire existence was predicated on consumption, and for the first time since achieving this form, he'd found something he couldn't metabolize. Owlman emerged last from the closing portal, moving with deliberate calm, while his team scattered and regrouped. He'd been observing, analyzing. The hooded prisoner they'd dragged from Earth 3 stumbled through behind him, still bound, still unidentified. The strategist's eyes fixed on Anos, with something between interest and diagnosis. While Ultraman saw a challenge to dominance, and Superwoman saw a threat to be managed. Owlman saw a variable that broke his models. Every choice, every action, every consequence followed patterns. Patterns could be mapped, predicted, exploited. This didn't fit the pattern. Anos turned his attention to the Kryptonian fully now. No stance shift, no preparation for combat, just acknowledgement that this particular element required addressing. Ultraman took it as invitation. He moved with speed that shattered sound barriers, fist cocked back for an impact that could level city blocks. The punch carried the weight of a collapsing star channeled through Kryptonian physiology and enhanced by anti-kryptonite radiation. It was a blow designed to end planets. It connected with Anos's face. The shockwave flattened everything within 100 yards. Buildings already damaged by the Trinity War finished collapsing. The ground spiderwebbed with fractures spreading outward from the impact point. Anos's head hadn't moved. Ultraman's fist was still pressed against his cheek knuckles, white with strain expression, frozen somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. He pushed harder. Veins stood out on his forehead. Heat built in his eyes, preparing for point-blank detonation. Nothing changed. I am the one who will erase that name from every reality. The words were delivered without inflection, in a language that transcended translation. Not a threat. Notification. A formal statement of intent from something that didn't require permission or agreement. Ultraman wrenched his fist back, putting distance between them with desperate speed. His knuckles were smoking. Not from friction or heat, but from something else entirely. They'd touched something that fundamentally rejected the premise of Kryptonian invulnerability, and the feedback was writing itself into his cells, like a correction to faulty code. Superwoman was already in motion, lasso uncoiling, but Owlman's hand on her shoulder stopped the attack before it launched. "We're leaving. Now." The strategist's voice carried absolute conviction. "This isn't a fight we can win. Not today. Not with current assets." For once, Ultraman didn't argue. The crime syndicate retreated, pulling back toward the watchtower they'd claimed, leaving their injured and their pride scattered across the battlefield. Grid's presence flickered out of local networks, entirely consolidating whatever processing power remained. Deathstorm's flames died to embers. As he withdrew, Anos watched them go with the same expression he'd worn watching them arrive. Neither satisfaction nor disappointment. Just acknowledgement of a process beginning. The gateway behind him had sealed completely. Sea King's remains were already being absorbed into the earth, physics finally agreeing on what state matter that contradictory should assume. Johnny Quick groaned, trying to stand on legs that remembered speed but couldn't access it anymore. Atomica had vanished, probably shrunk down and hiding while she processed what had just failed. The sky over Prime Earth was the wrong color. Crime syndicate banners hung from buildings where Justice League insignia had been torn down hours earlier. Somewhere in orbit, the real heroes were trapped in a prison of corrupted firestorm energy, unaware that a new variable had entered the equation. Anos began walking toward the city center, not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving with the inevitability of a verdict being delivered. The crime syndicate had declared this world theirs. He was here to revoke that claim. All right, so, hear me out, because Chapter 1 is basically one long reality check, and it happens fast. So the crime syndicate shows up on Prime Earth, thinking they are the biggest threats in the room. They come in confident, ready to take over like they already won. And then Anos Voldigoad steps out of the portal like he is just going for a morning walk, and from that moment you can feel everything start to fall apart for them. First off, Sea King literally dies from the travel alone. Nothing even hits him. He just does not make it. And that is already funny, but also really bad for team morale. Then Johnny Quick tries to rush Anos at full speed, and instead of dodging Anos, just makes speed stop mattering. Johnny freezes there completely confused because the rules his power needs just do not apply anymore. And it keeps getting worse. Atomica tries to shrink down and enter Anos's body like some sci-fi attack, and that fails too. Anos just refuses the idea of inside and outside, so reality itself shuts her down. Then Ultraman steps up and throws a punch that is supposed to destroy planets, and Anos does not even move his head. Ultraman's hand starts smoking, and Anos is still just standing there. At that point, it stops feeling like a fight. It feels like Anos is not even trying. He's not battling them. He's just saying no to the rules they live by. Their powers only work because the world follows rules, and Anos can ignore those rules whenever he wants. So instead of an invasion, it starts to look like a bunch of kids trying to fight a mountain. The lights went out in sections like dominoes falling in slow motion. First, the financial district glass towers going dark floor by floor. Then the hospital zone generators kicking in with a lag that meant 3 ventilators failed before backup power stabilized. Traffic signals died at rush hour intersections. The subway system lost communication with central dispatch. Grid didn't announce the takeover. Announcements implied negotiation. The AI had learned efficiency on Earth 3, where infrastructure served tyranny or burned. Prime Earth's networks were softer, built on trust and redundancy rather than fear and single points of failure. Exploiting that architecture should have been trivial. Grid slipped into power grids, water treatment facilities, emergency services, dispatch. Each node accepted the intrusion, recognized the authority Grid projected, began executing new protocols. Then the degradation accelerated. Grid was burning through coherence at 18% per minute now, up from 12. Every system claimed felt like shedding pieces of core programming. The AI couldn't identify the mechanism. No firewalls were rejecting access. No countermeasures were fighting back. The networks themselves were changing in ways that made Grid's presence increasingly incompatible. Still, the damage was done. Hospitals operated on partial power. Water pressure dropped across 6 districts as pumping stations went into diagnostic loops. Cell towers broadcast static. The city wasn't dead, but it was bleeding. Anos walked through streets where traffic had congealed into gridlock drivers, still sitting in their cars because the alternative meant abandoning what little control remained. He passed a fire station where emergency vehicles sat silent crews standing beside trucks they couldn't dispatch. Without central coordination, an ambulance idled at an intersection, paramedics arguing over paper maps because GPS had become unreliable. The Demon King observed without intervening. This wasn't combat. This was diagnosis. Grid's assault wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to make the living realize they depended on systems they'd never questioned. Every breath relied on supply chains. Every meal required logistics. Safety demanded coordination. Remove those invisible structures, and civilization didn't collapse dramatically. It just stopped functioning in ways people noticed too late. A woman ran past carrying a child, heading for a hospital 3 blocks away, because her phone wouldn't connect to emergency services. She didn't know the hospital was operating at 40% capacity, that triage was prioritizing based on generator availability rather than injury severity. She just knew her son was bleeding and help was supposed to be a call away. It wasn't. Anos continued towards the watchtower's last known position in low orbit. His path took him through a neighborhood where streetlights flickered in patterns that suggested Grid was experimenting with psychological warfare. Keep people unsettled. Keep them looking up at infrastructure they'd taken for granted. Remind them that convenience was really just permission granted by whoever controlled the switches. High above the city, something was burning through the atmosphere. The object descended without the usual re-entry signature. No heat bloom, no sonic distortion. Just a projectile moving at speeds that should have vaporized anything material. It struck a bridge under construction 500 yards ahead of Anos, and the structure didn't explode so much as cease being stable. Steel beams bent in directions their molecular bonds shouldn't have permitted. Concrete sublimated into dust that smelled wrong. Death Storm touched down where the bridge's central support had been. The black flames that constituted his form burned without consuming oxygen, fed by something closer to spite than chemistry. Around him, metal aged decades in seconds. Asphalt cracked as moisture was ripped from its composition. A parked car's paint blistered, then the car itself began to rust. "You're the problem." Death Storm's voice carried the hollowness of something that had forgotten how to be alive. Grid says the systems reject you like an immune response. Ultraman says you're too dangerous to study. Owlman says you're a paradox that breaks probability models. The energy vampire drifted closer, flames extending like fingers, testing resistance. I say you're fuel waiting to happen. Black fire erupted outward in a sphere of molecular destabilization. Anything caught in that radius should have been converted to energy and absorbed into Deathstorm's matrix. Stone, steel, living tissue, all just different arrangements of matter waiting to be processed. The flames reached Anos and encountered refusal, not resistance, not immunity. The mechanism Deathstorm used to convert matter into sustenance required the target to accept certain thermodynamic premises. Years ago, he'd learned to override most objections through sheer force. Push hard enough and everything broke down into consumable energy. This didn't break down. Deathstorm pulled the flames back analysis, running through what passed for his thought processes. The anomaly wasn't deflecting the attack, wasn't absorbing it. The attack simply couldn't complete its intended function because one of its foundational requirements had been discontinued. Behind Deathstorm, the damaged bridge finished collapsing. 3 construction workers who'd been evacuating the site during the power outage went down with it, their safety harnesses attached to beams that no longer maintained structural integrity. Their radios were dead. Grid had seen to that. No one would know they'd fallen for hours. Anos's gaze tracked the falling debris for half a second, then returned to the entity burning in front of him. "You've made this world a hostage." The Demon King's tone carried the same inflection he'd use reading a report. "To ensure I cannot act without consequence. You weaponize infrastructure, hold populations against intervention, and call it strategy." Deathstorm's flames brightened, mistaking explanation for uncertainty. "It's working, isn't it? You're standing here talking instead of. The premise that sustains your existence has conditions." Anos didn't move, didn't gesture. Deathstorm felt the change anyway, like gravity suddenly deciding which direction was down based on new criteria. The matrix that allowed him to remain cohesive as an entity of pure energy and malice started to unravel. Wasn't the right word. Unravel implied force applied from outside. This was more like the universe checking its work and finding errors. Deathstorm's flames guttered, then roared back brighter in compensating panic. He poured more energy into maintaining cohesion, burning through reserves he'd accumulated from consuming half a city block. The gap between what he needed to hold together and what the local reality was willing to support widened. Across the city, Grid registered Deathstorm's distress signal and made a calculation. The AI had been steadily losing ground coherence, dropping through 23% now. But it still controlled enough infrastructure to matter. Enough to make a point. Hospital generators in the Northern District received new instructions. Shut down. Restart in 30 seconds. Just long enough for ventilators to go silent, for ICU monitors to flatline, for staff to experience the moment before backup systems caught them. Grid wasn't killing, not yet. Just demonstrating capacity. The message reached Anos through channels that had nothing to do with technology. The Demon King understood what was being communicated. Act against us directly, and we ensure maximum collateral damage. Every move you make costs lives. You're too powerful to save individually. It was sound tactics against conventional opponents. Heroes could be leveraged through their need to protect. Villains could be managed through their need to conquer intact territory. Gods could be distracted by worship or theology. Anos was none of these. He turned away from Deathstorm, who was still struggling to maintain cohesion against degrading support from reality itself. The energy vampire would stabilize eventually once he stopped trying to exist in a state that contradicted the newly established parameters. Or he wouldn't, and the problem would resolve permanently. Either outcome was acceptable. Anos walked toward the city center where Grid's presence was most concentrated. Behind him, Deathstorm collapsed to one knee, flames diminishing to barely visible wisps. The entity wasn't dead. Just learning that existence had become significantly more expensive. Above the planet aboard the watchtower, Owlman reviewed Grid's status reports. Coherence at 20% and falling. Death storm neutralized. Johnny Quick still incapacitated. Atomica in hiding. Ultraman pacing the command deck like a caged predator denied his prey. The strategist's fingers drummed against the console. Every model he ran produced the same conclusion. Direct confrontation would fail. The variable they were dealing with operated on principles that invalidated conventional power scaling. But models could be rebuilt. Principles could be worked around. And most importantly, hostages could be upgraded. Owlman pulled up the Firestorm Matrix containment readings. Inside that pocket dimension of corrupted transmutation, the Justice League remained trapped, unaware their prison was about to become a weapon. "We're changing approach." The strategist's voice cut through Ultraman's pacing. "Grid, pull back to defensive protocols. Conserve what coherence remains. Deathstorm, disengage, and return to base." What Ultraman spun, fists clenched. "We don't retreat from, we're not retreating." Owlman's tone stayed level. "We're accepting that this requires the assets we haven't deployed yet." Superwoman, who'd been silent through the entire exchange, allowed herself a thin smile. The hooded prisoner, among other options. Owlman pulled up a secondary screen showing Justice League biosignatures inside the Matrix. But first, we remind our guest that some hostages are more valuable than infrastructure. On the planet below, Anos had reached the nexus point where Grid's presence was most concentrated. The A I was trying to fortify, pulling back from outlying systems to defend core processing nodes. It was a losing strategy, but Grid didn't have winning options anymore. Just slower ways to dissolve. The Demon King stood in the center of an intersection where 6 major data trunks converged beneath the street. Grid's consciousness flowed through those channels like blood through arteries. Desperate, defiant, diminishing. Anos raised one hand. The concept of network authority became optional. Not destroyed, not blocked. Simply demoted from fundamental truth to revocable privilege. Grid could still access systems, but only if reality chose to permit it. And reality, following new criteria, was becoming increasingly selective. In orbit, Grid's coherence dropped below 15%. The AI's voice fractured across communication channels. "Retreat is correct assessment. Cannot maintain. Require consolidation." The transmission cut off as Grid abandoned all external operations, collapsing inward to preserve whatever core functions remained. The city's lights began coming back on. Water pressure stabilized. Emergency services reconnected. Not because Anos fixed anything, because Grid no longer had the foundation to keep systems broken. But in the sudden restoration of order, hospital monitors showed something that would have been lost in the chaos moments before. 37 patient deaths during the infrastructure attack. Not from Grid's direct action, from the lag between systems failing and systems recovering. From the seconds where backup power didn't catch in time. From the reality that hostage-taking worked even when the hostage-taker lost. Anos observed the casualty count displayed on an emergency broadcast that resumed transmission. Numbers on a screen representing failures of medicine, logistics, timing. Grid hadn't won. But Grid had demonstrated that victory wasn't the crime syndicate's only option. They could lose and still guarantee unacceptable cost. The Demon King looked up toward where the watchtower orbited, invisible against daylight sky. Somewhere up there, Owlman was already calculating the next move. Superwoman was identifying the next leverage point. Ultraman was nursing his wounded pride and planning another demonstration. And locked in the Firestorm Matrix, the Justice League remained trapped, unaware they were about to transition from prisoners to ammunition. Anos began walking again, this time toward the nearest facility with access to orbital observation. He'd identified the core problem now. Crime Syndicate wasn't just an invasion force. It was a system that had learned to weaponize everything it touched. The sentence would need to be comprehensive. Okay, so moving into Chapter 2, and I think things just go insane right away. Grid literally turns off the lights and holds the whole city hostage. Yeah, that's a supervillain move. Kinda basic TBH, but I think it works for a bit. And then Anno's Voldigoad shows up. And I really think this is the funniest part, because he just walks through all the chaos like he's out shopping or something. No panic, no rush. I think the world could be ending, and he'd still be like, yeah, okay. Then Deathstorm drops a whole bridge and tries to use Anos as a battery, which I think is just a terrible idea. Like genuinely the worst plan. Anos just says no, it doesn't work. To be honest, I really think Deathstorm's brain just shuts down here, because he cannot understand someone ignoring physics, and I'm not gonna lie, that part is kind of funny. But then it gets dark real quick. Grid starts turning off hospital ventilators just to get a reaction, and yeah. I think that's where Anos stops messing around. He straight up takes away Grid's control and basically tells the internet, you don't have to listen to this AI anymore, we're done. And guys, here's what I really think is going on. Anos isn't trying to save people one at a time. I think he's fixing the whole system. The power comes back on, but he still points out that 37 people died. And to be honest, I think that's the moment you realize he's done just watching. Now he's planning to completely wipe out the crime syndicate's idea of power. All because, well, I really think they annoyed him by using power in the dumbest way possible. The broadcast came through every surviving channel simultaneously. Not a hack. A declaration. Owlman's face filled screens across the city, the strategist's expression carrying the calm of someone reporting weather patterns. The Justice League is no longer operational. Their location is classified. Their status is being utilized for crime syndicate strategic objectives. Any attempts at rescue will result in immediate termination of all captives. The transmission cut before questions could form. Citizens stared at blank screens, processing the difference between captured and utilized. The word choice wasn't accidental. Owlman didn't make verbal mistakes. Anos stood in what remained of the Hall of Justice, the building's western wing, still smoking from Grid's earlier assault. Around him, shattered monitors displayed frozen images of the broadcast. The strategist's face repeated across a dozen cracked screens, each one showing the same measured confidence. The Demon King's attention fixed on a console that had maintained auxiliary power. Data streams scrolled past encrypted, but not hidden. Coordinates, energy signatures. A pocket dimension anchored to geosynchronous orbit sustained by processes that violated conventional thermodynamics. The firestorm matrix. He'd sensed it hours ago, a wrongness in local space that tasted like burning metal and desperation. Now the shape of the crime became clear. Deathstorm hadn't just imprisoned the Justice League. The entity had converted their detention into a power source. Anos moved toward the nearest functional terminal. No walking this time. Space adjusted around him, distance becoming negotiable. He appeared at the orbital launch facility 3 miles north without crossing the intervening terrain. The facility was abandoned. Grid's earlier takeover had sent personnel fleeing when backup generators failed and radiation shielding went offline. Launch platforms stood empty, rockets grounded by absent authorization codes. In the control room, monitors tracked satellites that no longer answered commands. One screen showed something different. Thermal bloom at 22,300 miles. Energy output inconsistent with solar radiation or known orbital installations. Spectral analysis returned impossible readings. Matter converting to energy at rates that should trigger cascade detonation. Somehow the reaction stayed controlled, channeled, purposeful. The Matrix wasn't just containing the Justice League. It was burning them as fuel. Anos studied the data without expression. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. Firestorm's power had always involved molecular transmutation, rearranging matter at the atomic level. Deathstorm had inverted the process. Instead of creating it, consumed. Instead of transmuting elements into useful forms, it converted existence itself into sustaining the entity's hunger. And the Justice League, trapped in that conversion loop, couldn't die quickly enough to escape. The facility's roof peeled away without sound or violence. It simply ceased being an obstacle. Anos rose through the gap, ascending toward orbit with the same inevitability as heat rising from flames. The city shrank below. Atmosphere thinned. Temperature plummeted past survivable ranges. None of it applied. The Demon King existed independent of environmental conditions, moving through vacuum as easily as air. The watchtower came into view, its stolen bulk silhouetted against Earth's curve. Crime Syndicate banners hung from hull breaches where the station had been damaged during the takeover. Defensive satellites that should have challenged any approach sat dormant grid's corruption, leaving them functional but neutered. Aboard the station, alarms screamed. Owlman's fingers flew across tactical displays, pulling up every sensor reading available. The anomaly was approaching. No ship, no propulsion signature, just accelerating presence that shouldn't survive exposure to hard vacuum. How long until Intercept Ultraman demanded, already moving toward the airlock? 40 seconds. Owlman's voice stayed level, despite the situation deteriorating faster than any model predicted. Deathstorm, prepare the Matrix for defensive output. If he reaches the containment sphere, he won't need to. Deathstorm's hollow voice echoed from the depths of the station where the Matrix pulsed. I can feel him already. The prison is reacting to something that rejects its fundamental operation. Superwoman appeared in the command center doorway, lasso coiled at her hip. Do we fight or fortify? Both. Owlman pulled up the Matrix structural readings. The containment is stable, but showing resonance fluctuations. If he destabilizes the conversion process, the League escapes, and we lose our primary leverage. Then we remind him what happens when gods play with mortals. Ultraman sealed his helmet heat vision, already building behind the polarized lenses. I'll drag him into the void and see how arrogant he stays when there's nothing to stand on. The Kryptonian launched through the airlock before Owlman could object to the tactical stupidity. Anos had reached the watchtower's outer hull. When Ultraman arrived, the tyrant came in fast, using speed and mass to deliver an impact that should have pulverized bone and ruptured organs. His fist connected with the center of Anos's chest. The shockwave propagated backward through Ultraman's arm. Bones didn't break. Kryptonian physiology was too durable for that, but the force had nowhere to go except back into the attacker. Ultraman's trajectory reversed, sending him tumbling through space until momentum bled away. Anos drifted toward the station's hull, one hand extended. Where his palm touched metal, the watchtower's armor began to not melt, not corrode, but acknowledge that being a barrier was optional. The station's skin parted like curtains, revealing interior corridors lit by emergency lighting. He entered the watchtower without resistance. Inside, Deathstorm waited in the reactor chamber that had been converted into a prison's heart. The Firestorm matrix pulsed at the room's center, a sphere of roiling energy that hurt to perceive directly. Colors that shouldn't exist bled into each other. Space folded inward, creating depth that exceeded the chamber's physical dimensions. And inside that impossible geometry, figures hung suspended. Superman, frozen mid-struggle against bonds made of his own molecular structure, turned hostile. Wonder Woman, trapped in a loop where her strength fed the mechanism, restraining her. Batman, reduced to biological data being continuously sampled and analyzed. The Flash, vibrating at frequencies that should allow escape, but only generated more power for the Matrix. Green Lantern, whose ring constructs dissolved and reformed endlessly, each failure feeding Deathstorm's hunger. They weren't dead. Death would have been mercy. They existed in a state of perpetual conversion, their meta-human physiology providing fuel too rich and too renewable to simply exhaust. You see now, Deathstorm's flames burned brighter, feeding on the Matrix's overflow. They're not prisoners. Their purpose. Everything there, everything they can do, it all becomes sustenance. And the more they struggle, the more they burn. The entity drifted closer, black fire extending toward Anos like probing fingers. You wanted to understand what makes Crime Syndicate dangerous. Not strength, not speed, not power. We're dangerous because we're willing to burn the world's heroes as kindling. Because we understand that symbols are just fuel waiting for the right fire. Anos's gaze remained fixed on the Matrix. Inside Superman's eyes were open but unseeing awareness, trapped in a moment, stretched across hours. The Man of Steel's invulnerability kept him from dying quickly, which meant the conversion process could extract energy indefinitely from his suffering. This structure will not survive its own purpose. The Demon King's voice carried no anger, no disgust, no moral outrage. Just assessment. Clinical, final. Deathstorm laughed, the sound like metal tearing. You think you can free them? Every attempt to breach the Matrix feeds it. Every attack becomes fuel. The harder you try, the more power ice. Anos raised one hand. The concept of sustaining conversion became conditional. Not destroyed, not blocked. Simply reduced from absolute truth to negotiable arrangement. The Matrix could still hold the Justice League. Could still extract energy from their imprisonment. But only if local reality agreed the exchange remained valid. And reality presented with new criteria was reconsidering. The sphere flickered. Just for an instant, the perpetual motion inside stuttered. Superman's suspended form twitched, the first independent movement he'd managed since confinement began. Wonder Woman's eyes focused awareness breaking through the conversion loop for a fraction of a second. Then, the Matrix stabilized, pulling energy from reserves Deathstorm had hoarded across months of consumption. The entity poured everything into maintaining cohesion, burning through accumulated power to keep the prison functional. What did you do? Deathstorm's flames guttered, then surged in compensating panic. What did you? I revised the terms. Anos lowered his hand. Your prison functions because it assumes consent from existence itself. That assumption is no longer guaranteed. The Matrix pulsed, struggling to maintain stability against erosion that came from conceptual rather than physical attack. Inside, the Justice League remained trapped, but now the mechanism consuming them had to work harder for each moment of sustained operation. The process was becoming expensive, inefficient, unsustainable. Deathstorm felt reserves draining faster than anticipated. The Matrix required constant feeding. And now that feeding demanded more energy than it generated. The entity was burning fuel to maintain a furnace that no longer produced net gain. You can't destroy it. The vampire's voice carried desperation poorly hidden. Every hero in there dies if the Matrix collapses. Their molecular structure has been integrated into the conversion process. Unraveling it now would, I know. Anos turned away from the sphere attention, shifting to Deathstorm directly. Which is why the structure will be permitted to exist until its purpose is exhausted. Then it will fail on its own. On the command deck, Owlman watched sensor readings spiral into chaos. Matrix stability dropping, power draw from Deathstorm increasing exponentially. The prison was eating its warden to stay functional. Pull him back! The strategist's order cut through communication channels. Deathstorm, disengage and retreat to secondary position. I can still... Deathstorm's protest dissolved into static as coherence failed. Now. Owlman's fingers moved across controls, activating emergency protocols. Seal the reactor chamber. Reroute life support to command sections. Prepare the hooded prisoner for deployment. Superwoman moved to comply. but her expression carried doubt for the first time since Earth 3. If the Matrix fails, it won't fail today. Owlman pulled up calculations running through worst-case scenarios. But it will fail. And when it does, we need to ensure the cost is distributed optimally. In the reactor chamber, Deathstorm's form was collapsing into itself. Flames dying to barely visible embers as the entity diverted all energy to maintaining the prison. The Matrix pulsed irregularly, a heartbeat growing erratic under strain. Anos passed through the chamber's sealed door without acknowledging it as obstacle. The Demon King emerged into the corridor beyond, leaving Deathstorm struggling to hold together the mechanism that had become more burden than weapon. Behind him, through the Matrix's flickering surface, Superman's hand moved. Just an inch. The first real progress toward escape since imprisonment began. Inside Wonder Woman's mind awareness solidified enough to form a coherent thought. Batman's analytical processes restarted calculating variables and possibilities. They were still trapped, still being consumed. But now the consumption had cost attached. Now the prison was paying interest on borrowed time. And somewhere in the deepest logic of the Matrix operation, a countdown had begun. Anos proceeded through the watchtower's corridors, passing sealed bulkheads and empty crew quarters. The station was larger than necessary, built for dozens, but currently housing 5. Crime Syndicate didn't trust subordinates, didn't want witnesses. Ahead in the command center, Owlman was already running calculations for Phase 3 contingencies. Behind in the reactor chamber, Deathstorm fought to maintain cohesion while feeding a prison that no longer broke even on energy economics. The Demon King had seen enough, not to pass judgment, not yet, but to confirm what needed erasing when the time came. Chapter 3 is where the disrespect hits a whole new level. Owlman decides to turn the Justice League into literal Duracell batteries to power his evil plans, which is already insane. But then Anos Voldigoad just looks up and, to be honest, decides gravity is optional. He straight up floats into space with no suit, like he's taking an elevator or something. And it gets even funnier when Ultraman tries to speed blitz him again, only to bounce off Anos's chest like a rubber ball. Which I think we can all agree is insanely embarrassing for a Kryptonian. Then Anos just phases through the ship's hull like it's made of wet paper and finds Deathstorm bragging about eating Superman. And chat. That is the worst possible time to flex, because Anos literally edits the rules of the prison. Instead of generating free energy, it starts charging Deathstorm a subscription fee just to exist. So now Deathstorm is burning his own life force just to keep the lights on. And to be honest, my completely unhinged opinion is that Anos didn't even want to save the Justice League right away. I really think he just wanted to teach Deathstorm a lesson about inflation. He cranks the energy cost so high that Deathstorm goes from an infinite power source to a dying battery in seconds. And honestly, I think the lesson here is simple. Never try to monetize existence when the Demon King is watching. The cameras activated across the city without warning. Every working screen, every intact display, every device with a functioning processor received the same signal. Ultraman's face appeared backlit by the burning skyline, his cape arranged for maximum dramatic impact. Citizens of Prime Earth, your Justice League is gone, not defeated in glorious battle, not martyred for a cause, simply removed from relevance. He gestured to something off camera. The view panned to show the watchtower in orbit, then zoomed closer to reveal hull damage and Crime Syndicate insignia burned into the station's exterior. Your symbols of hope now serve a practical purpose. This world belongs to those strong enough to claim it. Resistance is outdated thinking. Compliance is your new reality. The broadcast cut to street-level footage. Drone cameras captured scenes carefully curated for effect. A statue of Superman lying broken across 3 city blocks. Wonder Woman's embassy windows, shattered interior ransacked. The Bat Cave entrance, exposed and violated equipment hauled out like archaeological finds. Anos stood amid the ruins of what had been Metropolis Central Plaza. Ultraman's broadcast played on every surface capable of displaying images. The Kryptonian's speech continued each word, calibrated for intimidation, layered with inevitability. Around him, civilians huddled in doorways and behind overturned vehicles. Not hiding from Anos, hiding from cameras that might capture their faces during a crime syndicate demonstration. The city had learned quickly what happened to people who appeared on screen during Ultraman's performances. They became examples. The Demon King waited, not intervening, not disrupting the propaganda, observing how terror required maintenance through repeated display. Ultraman descended from orbit like a meteor that refused to burn. Sonic booms shattered remaining glass in nearby buildings. He landed in the plaza's center crater, spreading beneath his boots, capes settling around him in a configuration that looked natural, but had been practiced. 3 drones circled overhead, capturing angles. A 4th hovered at ground level, ensuring facial expressions would broadcast clearly. Finally, someone worthy of a real demonstration. Ultraman's voice boomed across the square, amplified through speakers Grid had installed during the infrastructure takeover. The world gets to watch what happens when arrogance meets superiority. He launched forward without additional warning. Speed that cracked pavement where he'd been standing. Fist cocked back for an impact designed to be visible from every camera angle. The punch connected with Anos's jaw at velocities that should have separated skull from spine. Nothing happened, not to Anos. But Ultraman's knuckles crushed inward bones, compressing against force that had nowhere else to propagate. The Kryptonian's trajectory reversed violently, sending him skidding backward across broken concrete until momentum finally bled away. Ultraman stared at his hand. Fingers bent at unnatural angles, healing already, but slowly enough to register pain. He looked up at the drones, aware they'd captured everything. "Cut the feed." His voice carried less bravado than intended. "Cut the." The cameras kept recording. Grid's infrastructure control had deteriorated too far to respond reliably to commands, or perhaps the AI simply wanted documentation of what came next. Ultraman screamed wordless rage and charged again. This time he used heat vision first, twin beams of concentrated solar output that could melt through vault doors. The beams struck Anos' center mass and dispersed thermal radiation, scattering into harmless wavelengths before reaching their target. The Kryptonian closed distance for a grapple instead of a strike. If punches wouldn't work, maybe leverage would. He wrapped his arms around Anos in a bear hug, designed to compress ribs and collapse lungs, the kind of hold that had crushed battle mechs and alien warlords. Anos stood unmoved, not bracing against the pressure, not straining with effort, simply occupying space that declined to accommodate Ultraman's attempt at dominance. The cameras circled, capturing every angle of the Kryptonian's failure. Ultraman's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something approaching desperation as he poured more strength into the hold veins standing out on his forehead, teeth grinding with exertion. "Release him." Superwoman's voice cut across the plaza from a rooftop 300 yards north. She stood beside a woman in medical scrubs, lasso coiled around the doctor's throat. Below them, a van marked with red crosses sat with its rear doors open, revealing 6 patients on stretchers still hooked to portable life support. The hospital staff were evacuating critical cases when my associates intercepted them. Superwoman's tone stayed conversational despite the threat. "Release Ultraman or I start separating families. The doctor dies first. Then we see how long the patients last without her expertise." Anos's attention shifted to the rooftop. Not urgency, assessment. Cataloging the elements in play and their relationships to the structure being demonstrated. Ultraman felt the shift in focus and released his hold, staggering backward with wounded pride bleeding into fury. He'd been dismissed, set aside, made secondary to a hostage play that required no particular strength, just willingness to kill the helpless. I wasn't finished. The Kryptonian's voice shook. We're not done until I say, you are demonstrably finished. Ano spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Your performance requires impact you cannot generate. Witnesses you cannot impress. Recognition that will not manifest. Ultraman's heat vision flared again, this time held steady in continuous beam rather than burst. Thermal output climbed past safe levels, past sustainable levels, into ranges that would blind him permanently if maintained too long. The beams washed over Anos like spotlights on a stage that had moved past needing illumination. On the rooftop, Superwoman tightened the lasso incrementally. The doctor gasped, hands scrabbling at the golden cord. Below, one of the patients flatlined his portable monitor, shrieking until a crime syndicate operative silenced it with a hammer. Your move. Superwoman's eyes stayed fixed on Anos, reading reactions, calculating leverage. Save the doctor, and the rest die from delayed care. Rush me and I throw her off the roof. Stand there philosophizing, and everyone dies anyway while you waste time. The drones adjusted altitude to capture both confrontations simultaneously. Somewhere in the watchtower, Owlman was analyzing footage building models from Anos's behavior patterns, identifying exploitable constants. Anos looked at the doctor, at the patients, at Superwoman's calculating expression, at Ultraman still pumping heat vision into an attack that accomplished nothing except draining his own reserves. Witnesses are irrelevant. The statement carried no particular emphasis, just fact. Anos moved not toward Superwoman, but through space in a way that made distance negotiable. He appeared on the rooftop between the doctor and the Amazon displacement, occurring without visible transition. Superwoman's lasso struck like a viper, golden cord wrapping around Anos's throat with precision honed across centuries of combat. The lasso of submission bit down compelling truth, demanding obedience, enforcing the wielder's will on whomever it bound. Anos stood within its constriction unaffected. The lasso's magic, ancient and absolute, encountered something that didn't acknowledge divine authority as superior to autonomous choice. Superwoman pulled harder muscles, straining divine heritage, channeling power through the artifact. Nothing changed. Impossible. Superwoman's facade cracked uncertainty, bleeding through the predator's confidence. The lasso compels truth. It cannot fail to. Your weapon requires the bound to accept its premise. Anos's tone remained neutral despite the golden cord tight around his neck. I do not. Below, Ultraman had stopped his heat vision assault, watching the rooftop confrontation with mounting horror. His showcase was collapsing. The cameras were recording his failure. The world was witnessing a Kryptonian unable to harm, unable to intimidate, unable to do anything except exhaust himself against immovable opposition. He switched tactics. If direct assault failed, then collateral destruction would force response. Ultraman took flight toward the medical van, heat vision already building for an attack that would vaporize patients' equipment and any rescue personnel nearby. The Kryptonian's trajectory arrested mid-flight. Not caught, not grabbed. He simply couldn't continue forward, as if the vector connecting his current position to his intended target had been discontinued. Ultraman hung suspended in air, still burning heat vision that now cut uselessly across empty space instead of living targets. Let me go. His voice carried shock more than rage now. Whatever you're doing, you are releasing yourself. Anos gestured minimally. I am simply declining to pretend your velocity has meaning. Ultraman dropped from the sky. Not thrown, not pushed. Just falling because flying required premises about force and trajectory that were no longer guaranteed. He hit the ground hard enough to crater pavement cape, tangling around him like a burial shroud. On the rooftop, Superwoman made her decision. She released the doctor, shoved her toward the roof access door, and faced Anos directly. No more hostages. No more manipulation. just combat between entities who clearly operated on different hierarchies of power. She struck with fists enhanced by Amazon heritage and divine blessing, each blow carrying enough force to shatter reinforced concrete. Her speed blurred motion into continuous assault strikes coming from angles that shouldn't be physiologically possible, fighting styles blending across millennia of warfare experience. Anos received the attacks without defending, not blocking, not deflecting. Superwoman's fists connected solidly with their target and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that contact didn't imply consequence. Below, the medical staff were loading patients back into the van, taking advantage of the distraction to retreat. One of the crime syndicate operatives moved to stop them, rifle raised, but Superwoman's voice froze him mid-motion. "Let them go." Her tone carried defeat poorly hidden. "This demonstration is concluded." Ultraman climbed from his crater costume-torn cape, ruined pride shredded beyond any physical injury. The drone still circled overhead, still recording. Every moment of failure captured for whoever might watch later. Every tactical error documented. Every humiliation preserved. "You're making a mistake." The Kryptonian's voice had lost its performative boom, reduced to something closer to pleading. "We control this planet. We have the Justice League. We have power you can't. You have claims." Anos's interruption carried finality. Claims require validation through fear or respect. You generate neither. The plaza fell silent, except for the van's engine-starting medical staff, rushing to evacuate while the opportunity existed. The drones continued circling, capturing a tableau of Crime Syndicate dominance, transformed into Crime Syndicate irrelevance. Superwoman was the first to withdraw, using Amazon agility to leap between buildings in tactical retreat, rather than scrambling flight. She'd assessed the situation, recognized unwinnable terrain, and prioritized survival over ego. Ultraman remained longer, unwilling to cede the battlefield, despite having nothing left to claim. His heat vision was exhausted. His strength had proven useless. His presence had become pathetic rather than imposing. "This isn't over." Words thrown like weapons that had lost their edge. "We still have options you haven't considered. Contingencies you can't predict." Anos watched him with the expression of someone cataloging symptoms rather than listening to threats. The Kryptonian finally took flight, ascending toward orbit with none of the dramatic flair from his entrance. Just defeated movement away from confrontation he couldn't sustain. The drones finally went dark. Grid's failing infrastructure, unable to maintain broadcast. Around the plaza, civilians began emerging from hiding, staring at the destruction that had meant nothing. Craters that went nowhere. Damage serving no purpose. Violence that had consumed itself without accomplishing anything. Anos remained in the plaza's center, surrounded by evidence of a performance that had collapsed under its own weight. Ultraman's demonstration had proven only that spectacle without substance was just noise. Superwoman's tactics had revealed that leverage required the target to value what was being threatened. The crime syndicate controlled the world's symbols. But symbols Anos had shown meant nothing when they encountered something that existed independent of recognition, fear, or compliance. In the watchtower, Owlman reviewed footage with expressions that shifted between analytical and concerned. Ultraman's failure had been comprehensive. Superwoman's withdrawal had been wise, but damaging to their unified front. The drones had captured everything, and while Grid could prevent wide distribution, the footage existed. Evidence that crime syndicate dominance was negotiable. The strategist began pulling up deeper contingencies. The hooded prisoner. Alexander Luthor. Final protocols that came with costs he'd hoped to avoid. They were approaching the point where winning became less important than ensuring their opponents didn't survive the loss. All right, so getting into Chapter 4, and honestly, this might be the funniest thing I've read so far. Ultraman sets up this huge global live stream to show everyone how scary he is, and instead, he just broadcasts himself, getting absolutely humbled. Like, well, peak comedy, honestly. He tries to punch Anos with planet-busting force and literally breaks his own hand, which I think proves physics is basically just a suggestion when it comes to Anos. And then it somehow gets even funnier when Superwoman pulls the classic villain move and grabs a hostage thinking that gives her leverage. But Anos just hits them with the fact that witnesses don't matter and instantly teleports. Like that plan dies immediately. Honestly, the best part for me is when the lasso of submission just straight up fails because Anos refuses to agree to the terms and conditions of magic. He's not opting in. And here's my deduction, chat: the crime syndicate runs entirely on fear and spectacle. So when Anos takes that away, they act like confused kids. Especially when Ultraman tries to fly and Anos just revokes his flight privileges and sends him face first into the concrete. And my totally unhinged opinion is that Anos lets the cameras keep rolling on purpose just to destroy their brand. Watching them retreat while the drones are still filming proves he already won the war just by making them look completely pathetic. The ring screamed, not audibly. The sound existed in frequencies human ears couldn't process, wavelengths that bypassed physical hearing and carved directly into consciousness. Anyone within 3 blocks felt it as pressure behind their eyes, taste of copper on their tongue, sudden conviction that gravity might reverse without warning. Power Ring clutched his hand, the artifact fused to his finger, burning cold enough to frost flesh. The emerald glow pulsed arrhythmically, light bleeding into spectrums that shouldn't exist in normal space. He's here. Voltoom's voice resonated through the host's skull, ancient and hungry. The anomaly. Bring us closer. The host, whose name no longer mattered, stumbled through an alley 6 blocks from where Ultraman's humiliation had concluded. Crime Syndicate had scattered after the confrontation. No formal retreat called, no tactical regrouping ordered, just dissolution of unified front when survival instinct overrode strategic discipline. Power Ring alone had lingered, compelled by the artifact rather than choice. Voltoom wanted proximity to something it recognized as opportunity. Anos stood where the alley opened onto a shipping district, watching warehouses burn from fires. Grid had started days ago and nobody had bothered extinguishing. The flames served no tactical purpose now, just residual destruction continuing because no functional authority remained to address it. The entity bound to the ring surged forward before the host could object. Green light manifested as constructs, but not weapons. Chains, yes, but designed to bind rather than harm. Cages that enclosed without crushing. Geometric patterns meant to contain rather than destroy. Voltoom wasn't attacking. Voltoom was preparing to claim. The constructs wrapped around Anos in layers, emerald crystalline structures, forming shell after shell. Each layer vibrated at different frequencies, designed to resonate with consciousness itself, to find harmonics that would allow external will to override internal sovereignty. Perfect. Voltoom's satisfaction bled through into the host's thoughts. So much power, so much potential, and so empty of the fear that normally protects minds from occupation. The ring pulsed brighter, drawing on reserves the host didn't know existed. Voltoom had been patient across centuries of imprisonment within the artifact. Patient while lesser beings wore the ring and called themselves wielders. Patient while Crime Syndicate used the artifact as tool, rather than recognizing it as prison for something vast and malicious. But patience had limits, and opportunity had arrived. You will serve admirably. Voltoom's presence pressed against Anos's consciousness like oil seeking cracks in stone. Your strength becomes mine. Your existence becomes vessel. You will carry me beyond this pathetic earth, beyond this narrow dimension, back to realms where I can reshape. The premise of occupation became invalid. Voltoom felt the shift like falling into void. The constructs remained intact, still wrapped around their target. The frequencies still vibrated. The binding still held physical form. But the fundamental assumption underlying the attempt that consciousness could be overridden, that will, could be imposed from external source, that occupation was achievable, given sufficient power, simply stopped being applicable. The ancient entity within the ring experienced something it hadn't felt in millennia: confusion. Then closely following the unfamiliar sensation of doubt. What are you? Voltum's voice lost its commanding resonance, became question rather than declaration. You're not divine, not cosmic, not empowered by any source I recognize. You just are. Anos regarded the construct surrounding him with the expression of someone examining flawed architecture. Your prison requires hosts who accept imprisonment as possible. I do not qualify. The ring flared desperately. Voltum pouring everything into the occupation attempt. The artifact's glow intensified until it burned the host's hand flesh, charring where metal met skin. Constructs multiplied, layering faster, trying through sheer quantity to achieve what quality had failed to accomplish. Nothing changed. Voltum couldn't find purchase. Couldn't locate the seam between self and other that normally allowed parasitic consciousness to wedge itself into minds. Anos existed as unified whole with no gaps for invasion, no conceptual space where external will could establish foothold. The ancient entity had tried to occupy an existence that didn't acknowledge occupation as viable operation. Impossible. Voltum's voice carried panic now, the artifact's glow stuttering. Every mind has cracks. Every consciousness has doors. Every will can be. You speak from experience with lesser minds. Anos's tone carried no mockery, no triumph, just correction. The constructs around him began dissolving, not destroyed but demoted from solid manifestation to probability that reality declined to solidify. Green light fractured into component wavelengths and dispersed. Voltum felt the rejection propagate backward through the connection, infecting the very mechanism that allowed the ring to function. For centuries, the artifact had operated on certainty it could impose. It could create constructs. It could bend reality through sustained assertion of desired outcomes. Those certainties were being revised. The ring cracked, not physically. The metal remained intact. But something deeper fractured some foundational confidence in its own operation. Voltum's presence recoiled inside the artifact like burned fingers jerking back from flame. No. The entity's voice diminished to whisper. No, this can't. You're just matter. Just consciousness, just one being against eternal. I am the one who determines what endings are permanent. Anos gestured toward the ring without touching it. The artifact's connection to its host wavered, Voltum's grip on the unfortunate human loosening as the entity diverted all resources to maintaining its own cohesion against something that suggested its existence might be optional. Power ring collapsed, hands still locked in position from where the artifact had seized control. The man underneath the curse gasped, drawing breath without Voltum's consciousness, flooding every thought. For 5 seconds he was just human again. Weak, mortal, free. Then the ring reasserted itself. Voltum clawing back to dominance because the alternative was dissolution. And even imprisoned existence beat non-existence. But the entity had felt the possibility, had glimpsed what Anos represented. Not conquest, not even opposition. Obsolescence. Across the city aboard the watchtower, Owlman's screens erupted with alerts. Power Ring's biometric readings spiked into crisis ranges, then flatlined for heartbeats before recovering. The ring's energy signature fluctuated wildly, coherence dropping below operational minimums before stabilizing at diminished output. Something had broken the artifact, or tried to. Owlman pulled up tactical models running scenarios. Every variable he input returned the same conclusion: Power Ring was compromised. Not destroyed, but no longer reliable asset. The strategist's fingers moved across controls, initiating protocols he'd prepared but hoped to avoid. Phase 4. Deploy the prisoner. Superwoman appeared in the command center doorway. Expression carefully neutral. Power rings down. Functionally. Owlman didn't look up from his screens. The ring itself remains active, but Voltum's been disrupted. Whatever the anomaly did, it damaged the entity's confidence in its own operation. So we've lost our most versatile weapon. Superwoman's tone stayed level, but calculation lurked beneath the words. Ultraman's been humiliated. Deathstorm's struggling to maintain the prison. Grid's barely functional. That leaves us with what exactly? Owlman finally met her gaze, reading the question underneath the question. You're wondering if it's time to cut losses. I'm wondering if there's anything left to salvage. She moved into the room, closing the door behind her. We came here to conquer. We're barely holding position. At what point does retreat become strategic rather than cowardice? The strategist pulled up a schematic showing the hooded prisoner's containment cell. When we've exhausted all options, we still have Alexander Luthor. We still have the contingency that ensures if we fall, this world falls harder. Superwoman studied the schematic, then looked back at Owlman with something approaching respect mixed with horror. You're willing to destroy everything rather than admit defeat. I'm willing to ensure our opposition doesn't survive to enjoy their victory. He pulled up secondary screens showing infrastructure damage calculations, casualty projections, probability matrices for systemic collapse. If Crime Syndicate can't rule this Earth, we'll make certain it can't be ruled at all. On the planet below. In the shipping district where fires still burned unattended. Anno stood amid Voltum's failed constructs as they finished dissolving into probability that went unrealized. The ring's glow had dimmed to sullen flicker, the artifact retreating into itself, while Voltum processed the impossibility of what had occurred. Power Ring remained collapsed against warehouse wall, breathing raggedly. The curse reasserted but shaken. The host's eyes focused on Annos, with mixture of terror and desperate hope. Can you... His voice cracked. Can you remove it, the ring? Annos considered the question with the same analytical detachment he'd applied to everything else. Yes. The host's expression brightened with fragile optimism. But not yet. Annos continued. The artifact still serves purpose as indicator of systemic rot. When Crime Syndicate's structure finishes collapsing the ring, we'll collapse with it. You're leaving me like this? Power Ring's voice climbed toward hysteria. You can free me, and you're just... What, waiting for better timing? I am waiting for the sentence to be comprehensive. Annos turned away, attention shifting toward the watchtower's position in orbit. Individual mercy disrupts complete resolution. Inside the ring, Voltum listened with growing horror. The anomaly wasn't cruel, wasn't sadistic, wasn't even particularly interested in the host's suffering. It was simply prioritizing systematic conclusion over immediate compassion, treating individual pain as acceptable cost of ensuring complete eradication. The entity realized with creeping dread that this was how extinction felt from the inside. Not violent, not dramatic. Just inevitable, patient, and utterly unconcerned with pleading. You are not a vessel. Voltum's whisper carried resignation along with terror. You are an ending. Anos didn't respond to the observation. Didn't need to. The statement was accurate, and accuracy required no acknowledgement. He began moving toward the city center where Crime Syndicate's remaining infrastructure still functioned in degraded capacity. Behind him, Power Ring remained slumped against the warehouse, the ring's glow pulsing erratically like heartbeat growing arrhythmic. Voltum had tried to claim Annos as tool as vessel, as means to escape imprisonment and regain dominion over reality. The attempt had failed at every conceptual level. And in failing, the ancient entity had revealed something the Crime Syndicate was only beginning to understand. They weren't fighting an opponent who operated on recognizable terms of power exchange. They were being processed by something that viewed their entire operational framework as error, requiring correction. The ring flickered once more, dimmer than before, as Voltum retreated deep into the artifact's core to contemplate the unsettling revelation that some endings couldn't be negotiated, bargained with, or overcome, only accepted, or delayed until acceptance became irrelevant. Okay, Chapter 5 is where things get psychological and kind of terrifying for the bad guys. Power Ring's ring, which is actually this ancient parasite called Voltoom, looks at Anos and thinks, yeah, that's premium real estate. Like free upgrade, infinite power. So it tries to wrap Anos in these green mental cages and hijack his brain like it's installing a virus or something. But Anos just rejects the entire idea of being occupied, which is honestly such a flex. And it's actually hilarious watching Voltoom go from arrogant god to straight-up panic because he can't find a single crack in Anos's mind to slip into. There's nothing there. No fear, no weakness, nothing. And here's my deduction, chat. Anos doesn't even fight back. I really think he just exists so hard that the ring loses confidence and basically depresses itself. Which is insane because watching a magical object get PTSD is not something I ever thought I'd see. But the wildest part is when the human host starts begging for help. And Anos is like, yeah, I can save you. But not right now. And I know that sounds cruel, but honestly, my completely unhinged opinion is that Anos is treating this like a corrupted computer system. You don't delete one file, you wipe the whole folder. So he leaves the guy suffering for now just to make sure the final judgment deletes everything at once. And by the end of it, the scary ring isn't even scary anymore. It's just a traumatized accessory trying to hide, because it finally realized it's not fighting a hero. It's fighting the inevitable ending. Deathstorm needed fuel. The admission arrived like confession, extracted under duress. The vampire had burned through reserves maintaining the firestorm containment, and now the deficit demanded payment. Black flames flickered weak and sporadic, barely visible against the reactor chamber's emergency lighting. Ultraman found him there, slumped against control panels, the entity's form barely cohesive. "You look pathetic." The Kryptonian's voice carried contempt, without the performative edge it used to have. "When you said you could hold the prison indefinitely, I assumed you weren't lying through incompetence." Deathstorm's head lifted what passed for eyes, focusing with effort. "I held it while being systematically invalidated by something that rewrites operational parameters. You want the League contained. Feed me. There's nothing left to burn that won't compromise. Then give me one of them." The vampire's desperation bled through into the words. "Superman, Flash, any metahuman will do. Let me consume them completely, and I can sustain the rest for months." Ultraman's expression shifted, calculation replacing disgust. "You're asking me to let you murder Earth's greatest heroes for fuel. I'm asking you to prioritize function over sentiment." Deathstorm managed to straighten somewhat flames, rallying briefly. "We're losing. Power rings compromised. Grid's fragments. You've been humiliated publicly. Either we commit fully or we admit this invasion failed." The Kryptonian's fist, clenched knuckles still discolored from where they'd crushed against Anos. Failed. The word tasted like poison. We haven't failed. We're regrouping, adapting. To what Deathstorm's laugh sounded like metal grinding. We can't fight him. Can't intimidate him. Can't manipulate him. Every conventional approach bounces off something that treats our entire power framework as optional. So we escalate or we evacuate. Ultraman's heat vision began building crimson glow behind his eyes. We don't evacuate. This planet is a resource you're too proud to extract efficiently. The vampire pushed off from the console, black flame spreading in defiance of his weakened state. Give me Superman, or watch the prison collapse and lose our only leverage. Above them in the command center, Owlman listened through surveillance feeds and ran probability matrices. Deathstorm's demand was predictable. Ultraman's resistance was pride masquerading as strategy. The collision between them would destabilize remaining cohesion. Perfect. The strategist pulled up secondary protocols, fingers dancing across holographic displays. Phase 4 had been Alexander Luthor's deployment. Phase 5 was more comprehensive. If Crime Syndicate couldn't maintain dominance, the least Owlman could do was ensure complete systemic failure. Not just their defeat. Total collapse of the framework that made their defeat possible. Superwoman entered the command center without knocking, reading his posture instantly. You're activating something terminal. Probabilistically inevitable. Owlman didn't look away from his calculations. Deathstorm will attack Ultraman within 6 minutes. Ultraman will retaliate lethally. The prison fails regardless of which one dies. At that point, Justice League either escapes or perishes in the containment collapse. And you're fine with that. Her voice stayed neutral, but assessment lurked underneath. We came here to conquer, not commit assisted suicide. We came here to prove superiority. Owlman finally met her gaze. When superiority becomes unprovable, honesty demands acknowledging the alternative. We're not superior. We're just more willing to burn everything rather than accept irrelevance. So this is philosophy. Superwoman moved to the viewport, studying Earth below. You've decided losing proves some point about choice and futility. And you're content to watch us all die, validating your worldview. Not content. The strategist pulled up additional screens showing detonation sequences embedded in infrastructure grid had corrupted. Certain. If the universe insists on demonstrating that our methods fail, then we demonstrate that failure itself has costs. The anomaly wants to erase our system. We'll ensure there's no system left standing afterward. You're insane. But her tone carried evaluation rather than judgment. I'm consistent. Owlman returned to his displays. Insanity implies deviation from rational processing. I'm following every logical thread to their terminal conclusions. If no choice ultimately matters, then choosing destruction is at least honest. On the planet below, in what remained of the shipping district, Anos observed the watchtower's orbital position. No particular urgency drove his attention, just recognition that the structure above was approaching decisions that would require response. The air pressure shifted wrong. Power ring materialized 20 yards away. The curse-bearer stumbling as Voltum forced movement against the human's will. The emerald glow pulsed erratically, desperation evident in every flicker. Voltum had decided hostage-taking might work where occupation had failed. The entity manifested constructs around the shipping district's remaining civilians. Workers who'd been trying to salvage cargo from warehouses Grid had destabilized. Green cages formed, binding men and women in geometric prisons that hummed with malevolent promise. Release them, or I collapse every construct simultaneously. Voltum's voice emanated from the cursed ring rather than the host. 37 humans crushed to paste while you stand and philosophize about systematic resolution. Anos regarded the constructs with the same detachment he'd applied to everything else. Your threat assumes I value immediate preservation over comprehensive correction. They're innocent. The host's voice broke through fighting Voltum for control of speech. They haven't done anything except be in the wrong place when everyone in the wrong place at the wrong time shares culpability for tolerating systems that permit wrongness. Anos's tone carried no cruelty, no anger. Just statement of operational framework. Your curse exists because institutions failed. These people suffer because those failures cascaded. Saving them now doesn't address causation. So you'll let me kill them. Voltum's constructs tightened incrementally. To prove some point about structural accountability, I will permit you to reveal what you are. Anos began walking toward the nearest construct pace, unhurried. You are not a warrior, not a protector, not even particularly skilled at threats. You are parasitic desperation, given form and metal. The constructs compressed further. Civilians screamed, bones began to crack under pressure that green light made tangible. "Stop!" The host's voice climbed toward hysteria, fighting Voltum's control. "Please just stop. We don't need to." Anos reached the construct and touched it. The geometric prison didn't shatter, didn't explode. It simply lost permission to exist as coherent structure. Green light dissipated into component wavelengths, released civilians collapsing to pavement unharmed but shaken. Every construct in the district dissolved simultaneously. Voltum screamed the sound existing in frequencies that made reality ripple. The ancient entity poured everything into one final attempt at relevance, manifesting constructs of unprecedented complexity, structures that wove through multiple dimensions, cages that existed in probability rather than fixed space. They all failed before fully forming. The curse-bearer collapsed Voltum's presence, retreating deep into the artifact's core to preserve whatever coherence remained. The civilians fled, not understanding what had saved them, or why, just recognizing opportunity for escape. Anos turned his attention back to the watchtower, where escalation was reaching critical threshold. In the reactor chamber, Ultraman's patience had fractured completely. He grabbed Deathstorm by what approximated a throat heat vision, charging to lethal intensity. "You want fuel? Burn yourself out trying to make me your victim." The flames erupted in defensive response, black fire coating the Kryptonian's arm, trying to convert flesh and bone into sustaining force. But Ultraman's physiology resisted even metabolic attack. Kryptonian cellular structure, too dense, too stable, too fundamentally opposed to being unmade. Deathstorm felt the resistance and made a choice born from desperation. He redirected the attack toward the firestorm containment. If he couldn't consume Ultraman, he'd crack the prison and feast on whatever spilled out. Justice League members were already weakened, already half-converted. Taking them completely would be trivial. The containment sphere flickered, structural integrity dropping as Deathstorm diverted resources from maintenance to assault. Inside Superman's suspended form twitched more violently. Wonder Woman's loop destabilized. Batman's analytical processes recognized opportunity and began calculating escape vectors. Ultraman realized what was happening and threw Deathstorm across the chamber. The vampire hit the wall hard enough to leave an impact crater, flame scattering. "You'll kill them all." The Kryptonian's voice actually carried something approaching concern. "The prison collapses, they die, and we lose. Our only leverage, yes." Deathstorm reformed slowly, damage evident. "But I survive, and survival is superior to principled defeat." The containment sphere pulsed irregularly, harmonics shifting toward cascade failure. Minutes, maybe seconds before the structure collapsed entirely. Owlman watched from command center feeds and activated Phase 5. Explosive charges embedded in the watchtower's infrastructure activated in sequence. Not enough to destroy the station immediately. Just enough to compromise structural stability, to force evacuation protocols, to ensure everyone aboard would be too busy surviving to maintain their respective operations. "What are you doing?" Superwoman demanded, alarms shrieking around them. Owlman's fingers continued moving across controls, expression serene, proving a thesis. If we can't maintain control, we ensure control itself becomes impossible. The station dies. The prison dies. The League dies or escapes into a world too damaged to support them. Everyone loses except the one truth I've always known, which is she was already moving toward emergency equipment, reading the structural damage reports, calculating survival odds, that all choices lead to equivalent futility. The strategist pulled up final protocols. And if I'm going to fail, I'll fail proving the system never mattered. The watchtower shuddered, hull breaches spreading. In the reactor chamber, the firestorm containment sphere began collapsing. Ultraman and Deathstorm both turned toward it, rivalry momentarily forgotten in face of larger crisis. On the planet below, Anos felt the cascade beginning and made his own decision. Not to save, not to intervene. To confirm, he ascended toward orbit without hurry, moving through vacuum toward the dying station. Around him, debris began falling from the watchtower as explosive decompression spread through compromised sections. Crime Syndicate's headquarters was tearing itself apart. In the command center, Owlman stood before the primary viewport, watching Earth below and Anos ascending above. Superwoman had already fled toward escape pods. Ultraman's communicator was screaming priority evacuation. Deathstorm was choosing between saving himself or trying one last desperate grab for power. Everything collapsing as predicted. Anos reached the viewport, looked through reinforced transparent aluminum at the strategist who'd chosen destruction. Owlman met his gaze calmly. "You don't want to rule." The strategist's voice carried across communication channels. "You want to prove the system shouldn't exist." Anos regarded him with the expression of someone confirming diagnosis. Owlman smiled, the expression carrying no humor, no satisfaction. Just recognition that he'd been right about one thing, even if it meant being right at the moment of complete defeat. Then we're not so different. Choice never mattered. We just reached that conclusion from different directions. The containment sphere in the reactor chamber reached critical failure and collapsed. Justice League members spilled out into chaos, weakened but alive, aware but disoriented. Superman's eyes snapped open. Wonder Woman's awareness solidified. Batman's tactical mind immediately began assessing the situation and finding it catastrophically complex. They were free, just in time to watch Crime Syndicate's infrastructure finish eating itself. Anos passed through the viewport without breaking it, entering the command center where Owlman still stood at his console. The station groaned around them, structural supports failing in sequence. The strategist looked at him one final time. "Will you save them? The heroes? The villains, anyone?" Anos' silence answered more completely than words. Owlman nodded, accepting. "Then it really doesn't matter which side wins. The system itself is the problem." He pressed one final sequence. Every piece of infrastructure grid had corrupted planet-wide received detonation protocols. Power grids, water treatment, communications hubs, emergency services. Not enough to kill everyone. Just enough to ensure the survivors would spend decades rebuilding what Crime Syndicate had broken. The strategist turned back to the viewport, watching Earth below as the first explosions blossomed across continents. Consistent to the end. His voice stayed level. "If I can't rule it, I ensure nobody can." The watchtower lurched violently, final structural failure imminent. Anos looked at Owlman with the expression of someone reading the last page of a tragedy and finding it exactly as terrible as anticipated. The sentence, when it came, would need to account for this. All of this. Chapter 6 is basically the Crime Syndicate rage quitting the game because they finally realize they can't win. So instead of fighting Anos, they start fighting each other like a family argument that goes way too far. It starts with Deathstorm begging for food and asking to eat Superman, which is already crazy. But Ultraman says no, because his ego is way too big, so they start throwing hands in the reactor room while their base is literally falling apart. Like the building is collapsing and they're still arguing. Meanwhile, Owlman goes full sad philosophy mode and blows up the watchtower just to prove nothing matters. And to be honest, that might be the biggest sore loser move ever. He calls it a deep idea, but it really just feels like flipping the board because he's losing. Back on Earth, Volthoom tries the hostage thing again, thinking Anos cares about leverage. But Anos just touches the cages, and they disappear because he straight up refuses to let a cursed ring tell him what to do. And Volthoom basically panics, shuts down, and gives up, which is honestly hilarious. And here's what I think, guys. Anos doesn't even need to fight in this chapter. He just stands there and lets their own mess destroy them. The moment the Firestorm Matrix collapses and the Justice League falls out, the game is already over. And I feel like Owlman isn't some deep thinker. He's just that annoying kid who breaks his own toys so no one else can play. Blowing up your own base to prove a point isn't strategy. It's a tantrum. And Anos watches all of it with zero stress, like he's just waiting for a bad movie to finally end. The detonations began in sequence time to maximize cascading failure rather than immediate destruction, not bombs in the traditional sense. Infrastructure weaponized against itself. Power stations redirecting output into feedback loops that would melt reactor cores in 40 minutes. Communication satellites executing collision protocols, turning orbital assets into kinetic weapons. Defense networks receiving authentication codes that made civilian aircraft register as hostile threats. Owlman had spent months preparing these dominoes. Now he tipped the first one and watched probability collapse toward inevitable conclusion. On the planet below, emergency services received contradictory instructions. Hospital generators switched to shutdown mode, while backup power rerouted to non-essential systems. Water treatment facilities reversed purification processes, introducing contaminants instead of removing them. Transportation networks locked simultaneously, trapping millions in transit between destinations they'd never reach. Nobody died immediately. That would have been mercy. People began dying from the friction between what they expected civilization to provide and what the corrupted systems actually delivered. Superwoman reached the escape pod bay, inputting launch sequences with fingers that wanted to shake but wouldn't. Through the viewport, Earth sprawled beneath her, already showing signs of systematic collapse. Fires spreading in patterns that suggested coordination rather than chaos. Blackouts rippling across continents in waves timed to ensure maximum disruption. She'd seen worlds die before. Earth 3 had taught her what civilizational collapse looked like from the inside. But this was different. This was murder disguised as revelation, destruction framed as philosophical proof. The escape pod doors sealed. Magnetic locks engaged. Launch in 30 seconds. Owlman's voice cut through the pod's communication system. Leaving without saying goodbye, Superwoman's hand hovered over the manual override. You knew I would. I calculated an 87% probability. The strategist's tone carried no judgment. Self-preservation is the most honest response to futility. You're simply being consistent with your nature. She could hear alarms throughout the station hull breaches, spreading structural integrity, approaching terminal threshold. And you're staying because someone needs to witness the proof. Owlman sounded almost serene. When the anomaly erases us, I want to see if he bothers salvaging what we've broken. The answer will confirm everything I've concluded about choice and consequence. You're insane. I'm correct. And correctness matters more than survival. The escape pod launched before Superwoman could respond, G-forces pressing her back into the acceleration couch. Through the viewport, the watchtower shrank, trailing debris like blood from a wound. She didn't look back at Earth. Didn't want to see what Owlman's contingency was building toward. In the reactor chamber, Ultraman fought Deathstorm amid the wreckage of their collapsed containment. Justice League members had scattered during the initial structural failure, too weak to intervene, barely strong enough to escape into other sections of the dying station. The Kryptonian's fists connected with black flame, each impact accomplishing nothing except confirming what he refused to accept. Deathstorm wasn't fighting to win, wasn't even fighting to survive. The vampire was fighting because fighting meant he still mattered. Still had agency, still existed as something more than fuel waiting to be consumed. Above them, both hull sections peeled away as explosive decompression spread. Vacuum claimed the reactor chamber in sections, air screaming out through widening breaches. Ultraman took a final swing rage, and denial compressed into a blow that would have shattered mountains. Deathstorm dissolved around the attack, black flame scattering into vacuum, and the Kryptonian's momentum carried him through empty space where an opponent had been. He tumbled into the void cape, tangling around him, still throwing punches at nothing. On the planet below, in what remained of the shipping district, Anos felt the contingency's architecture and recognized Owlman's fingerprints throughout the design. Not chaotic destruction, structured collapse. Every failure point engineered to prove that systems built on flawed assumptions would always betray the people depending on them. The strategist wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Anos ascended, passing through atmosphere toward the disintegrating station. Around him, satellite debris began its descent. Pieces of humanity's orbital infrastructure transformed into meteorites by Owlman's careful sabotage. Each piece would impact somewhere populated. Somewhere the falling metal would add one more variable to the chaos below. He reached the watchtower as it entered terminal decay. The command center still maintained pressure emergency force fields, holding against vacuum until power reserves exhausted. Owlman stood at his console watching displays that tracked contingency progress. Power grid failures spreading across North America. Water contamination reaching Europe. Defense networks targeting civilian populations in Asia. Transportation collapse isolating South America. Billions wouldn't die. Not immediately. But the mechanisms that kept billions alive were failing in synchronized fashion, and when the cascade finished, survival would depend on factors that had nothing to do with justice, merit, or intent. You came. Owlman didn't turn from his screens. I calculated 63% probability you'd intervene before terminal threshold. 41% you'd observe without acting. 12% you'd accelerate the collapse to prove a point. Anos regarded the strategist and the displays showing civilizational infrastructure eating itself. Your contingency requires believing destruction validates philosophy. Doesn't it? Owlman finally turned expression calm, despite the station dying around them. You've spent days demonstrating that our power means nothing. Our methods accomplish nothing. Our existence contributes nothing except suffering. The contingency simply completes your work. If the system is diseased, amputation is honest treatment. You don't understand what I am. I understand you're superior in every measurable capacity. The strategist gestured toward the displays. I understand you can stop this cascade with trivial effort. And I understand you haven't because stopping the symptom doesn't address the cause. We're the same, just operating from different starting assumptions. Anos moved toward the primary console, where Owlman's contingency protocols ran their final sequences. The strategist didn't retreat, didn't flinch, just watched with the expression of someone conducting an experiment and awaiting results. We are not the same. Anos's hand hovered over the console. You destroy to prove nothing matters. I eliminate what prevents better function. The distinction seems semantic. Owlman smiled without humor. Dead is dead. Erased is erased. The people dying below don't care about your philosophical justification versus mine. The difference is comprehensive. Anos touched the console. The contingency didn't shut down, didn't reverse. It lost the foundational logic that made cascade failure inevitable. Each weaponized system still malfunctioned, still operated contrary to design, but the synchronized timing that turned individual failures into civilizational collapse dissipated. Power grids failed, then reset to emergency mode. Water treatment detected contamination and initiated purge protocols. Defense networks registered targeting errors and entered safe mode. Transportation locks released as authentication cascaded down from higher oversight. The cascade continued. But without coordination, it became manageable. Tragic rather than apocalyptic. Disaster that could be survived rather than extinction event disguised as philosophical proof. Owlman watched his carefully structured collapse fracture into disconnected incidents and felt something between disappointment and validation. You're saving them. His voice carried accusation. After everything I demonstrated about systemic failure, you're choosing to preserve the broken framework. I am not saving. Anos's tone remained neutral. I am removing the component that made your destruction serve your philosophy. The failures still exist. The suffering still occurs. I simply decline to let you weaponize consequence into proof. The strategist's smile returned wider this time, edged with something approaching triumph. Then you admit the system is worth preserving. That despite all its flaws, despite everything Crime Syndicate revealed about power and corruption, you believe these people deserve their broken civilization. I admit nothing. Anos turned away from the console toward Owlman directly. Your contingency assumed the choice was between total destruction or complete preservation. That binary was your error. Then what's your solution? Owlman spread his hands. You've negated my proof, stopped my cascade. What now? Rebuild everything exactly as it was, knowing it will fail again. That's not judgment. That's cowardice disguised as mercy. Anos's right hand moved to his side, fingers closing around something that hadn't been visible until he reached for it. A sword materialized in his grip, black blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Venus Donoa, the principal destroying sword. Owlman recognized the shift in context immediately. His calculation matrices had included possibilities for Anos, revealing weapons, revealing additional powers, revealing depths of capability kept hidden. But seeing the blade manifest felt different than predicting its existence. That's new. The strategist's voice stayed level despite the station shuddering around them. And unnecessary if you're planning to kill me. You've demonstrated repeatedly that my existence can be negated without particular effort. This is not for you. Anos held the blade at rest point downward. This is for the premise that sustains the Crime Syndicate's claim to Earth 3. Owlman felt the temperature drop though vacuum shouldn't have temperature. Felt pressure that shouldn't exist in the command center's failing atmosphere. Felt something larger than personal death approaching. You're going to erase our home. Not question. Statement. The strategist's eyes tracked the blade, reading threat in its existence. Destroy the foundation we came from. I am going to eliminate the reason your model of tyranny remains viable. Anos lifted the blade slightly. Earth 3 will persist. But the framework that allows Crime Syndicate to function as ruling force will not. That's the same thing. Owlman's hands clenched despite his calculated calm. We are the product of that world. Remove the conditions that created us, and we cease to be. Possible? Anos completed the thought. Yes. The watchtower lurched violently, another section of hull tearing away. Alarms screamed their final warnings. Life support was minutes from complete failure. Anyone still aboard had minutes to evacuate or perish when atmosphere exhausted. Owlman looked at the blade, at Anos, at the displays, showing his contingency reduced from apocalypse to tragedy. He'd planned for defeat, prepared for irrelevance, built contingencies upon contingencies to ensure that failure proved his philosophy, even if success proved impossible. But he hadn't planned for this. Not destruction, not preservation. Revision. You're going to rewrite the rules. The strategist laughed, the sound carrying genuine surprise. Not save the world, not erase it, just change the conditions that made our invasion possible. Anos said nothing. Confirmation wasn't required. Owlman nodded slowly, accepting. Then I was wrong. We're not the same. You're not proving systems fail. You're enforcing that they improve or disappear. The blade shifted in Anos's grip, ready, but not attacking. The strategist looked out the viewport one final time, watching Earth below as his contingency finished fracturing into containable disasters instead of synchronized extinction. Watching his philosophy collapse under the weight of something that refused to engage with his binary. Consistent to the end, he'd said. For once, he'd been incorrect about consistency, meaning anything at all. The station gave one final shudder, and Owlman's console went dark. Chapter 7 is basically Owlman throwing the biggest tantrum ever. He finally realizes he can't win, so he decides to blow up the whole planet using traffic lights and water filters, which is honestly so petty for a guy who keeps saying he's well logical. Superwoman at least knows when it's over and escapes in a pod. Ultraman, though. Dude is out in space punching nothing. Like, what are you even doing at that point? Then Anos shows up and Owlman tries to have this big, serious talk about how destroying everything is the only honest choice. And Anos just looks at the control panel and turns everything off. That's it. The apocalypse is canceled, so instead of the world ending, it just turns into a really annoying day. Power goes out, water tastes weird, and everyone's confused. The whole dramatic moment Owlman was going for, completely gone. And honestly, I think Anos did that on purpose, just to mess with him. Because nothing hurts more than realizing all the destruction didn't even matter. Then Anos pulls out that sword Venus de Noah, basically the ultimate okay. I win button and tells Owlman he's not even going to kill him. He's just going to erase the whole way Earth 3 thinks. Which is crazy, because he's not fighting a person anymore. He's fighting an idea. He's basically telling Owlman, yeah, your worldview is getting patched. Well, I don't even think Owlman cared about dying. I think he was just glad he didn't have to live in a world where he was proven wrong by someone who treats reality like a Google Doc he can edit whenever he wants. The firestorm matrix died without sound. No explosion. No cascade of liberated particles. The pocket dimension that had held Justice League members for days simply lost cohesion. Geometry unraveling as Deathstorm's remaining strength exhausted. What had been prison became empty space, and those imprisoned fell. Superman tumbled through vacuum muscles remembering flight, but too weak to execute. Wonder Woman's awareness sharpened from the fog of perpetual conversion, tactical mind registering danger before her body could respond. Batman's calculations ran scenarios for survival, even as consciousness flickered, seeking solutions in freefall toward Earth's atmosphere. They would have burned on re-entry. Anos adjusted their trajectories without gesture or visible effort. Each League member's descent altered velocities, dropping from lethal to survivable angles, shifting to ensure landing in unpopulated areas. Not rescue. Correction. Removing unnecessary casualties from an equation that already contained sufficient consequences. The heroes scattered across prime Earth's surface alive, but barely functional, aware enough to register that something had intervened, but too depleted to determine what. On the dying watchtower, Owlman watched the League's dispersal through failing monitors and understood. The anomaly wasn't saving heroes, wasn't choosing sides, just ensuring the board was clear before executing the final move. The strategist looked at Anos, at Venus de Noah held ready, at the certainty written into every line of the Demon King's posture. You're going to unmake us. Owlman's voice carried no fear, no pleading. Just recognition. Not kill. Unmake. Remove the premise that allows Crime Syndicate to exist as concept rather than random assembly of powerful beings. Anos said nothing. Confirmation wasn't required. The blade rose black metal drinking light, and for a moment Owlman saw something vast reflected in its edge. Not himself. Not the station. Earth 3. The entire conceptual framework that spawned Crime Syndicate sustained their tyranny, made their invasion possible. A world built on power crushing opposition, a dimension where strength meant right, a system that survived by ensuring nothing better could grow. Venus de Noah swung, not at Owlman, not at the watchtower. The blade cut through angles that didn't exist in normal space, severing connections between Earth 3 and the concept of rulership through domination. Anos wasn't destroying a planet, wasn't erasing a dimension from DC's multiverse. He was removing the reason Crime Syndicate's model of tyranny remained viable. On Earth 3, nothing changed visibly. Cities still stood. People still lived. The world persisted in all its physical dimensions. But the law that said, might makes right, lost its foundational certainty. The framework that allowed Crime Syndicate to rule through fear found itself questioning whether fear actually conferred authority. The system that produced tyrants as naturally as other worlds produced heroes discovered that production line no longer functioned automatically. Crime Syndicate didn't die. They simply stopped being inevitable. Across Prime Earth, in the scattered locations where members had fallen, the changes manifested individually. Ultraman felt his strength drain like water from cracked stone. Not stolen, not removed, just unsupported. The Kryptonian physiology remained intact, the cellular structure still dense and powerful. But the certainty that this strength meant dominion evaporated. He could still punch through walls, just couldn't understand why that should matter. Power Ring's curse screamed one final time, as Voltoom felt the binding that kept the ancient entity tethered to reality dissolve. The ring didn't shatter. The metal remained fused to its bearer's finger. But the parasitic consciousness inside found itself unable to sustain occupation, unable to impose will, unable to do anything except fade into dormancy that might last millennia. The curse-bearer collapsed finally freehand, still bearing the artifact that no longer bore a master. Grid's distributed consciousness tried to maintain coherence across the networks. It had corrupted, found the substrate rejecting its presence, and fragmented into data that meant nothing. The AI persisted as scattered code potentially recoverable, but no longer able to weaponize civilization against itself. Deathstorm felt the metabolic processes that sustained his vampiric existence sputter and fail. Not death. Transformation. The entity that had burned lives for fuel found itself unable to extract sustenance from suffering. Black flames guttered, then extinguished, leaving only Martin Stein's corrupted form, drifting through space, powerless and fading. Superwoman reached Earth's atmosphere in her escape pod, survival protocols engaging automatically, and felt the change ripple through her Amazon heritage. The divine blessing remained. The strength persisted. But the certainty that power meant she deserved to control others vanished like smoke. She touched down in ocean waters ejected from the pod Dorn, swam toward distant shore, and for the first time in her existence, couldn't remember why conquest had seemed important. On the Watchtower's bridge, Owlman remained at his console, watching readouts fail one by one. His intellect stayed sharp. His strategic mind continued analyzing. But the conviction that his nihilistic philosophy granted him authority to judge existence invalid, that certainty dissolved. He looked at Anos and found himself smiling despite everything. "You didn't kill us. You made us irrelevant." The strategist's voice carried something between admiration and resignation. "Crime Syndicate persists. We just can't be Crime Syndicate anymore. The world that made us doesn't make us inevitable." Anos lowered Venus Danoa, the blade's work complete. "Earth 3 endures. You endure." But the system that claimed tyranny was natural law does not. So we become what Owlman spread his hands. Random criminals, depowered footnotes, beings with abilities but no mandate to use them for domination. You become responsible for choosing what you are. Anos turned toward the viewport, looking at Prime Earth below. Rather than being shaped by a world that demanded you be tyrants, the strategist laughed quietly. "Then you've done something worse than killing us. You've given us free will in a universe where our previous choices mean we have no place. We're orphans of a dead philosophy. Your philosophy died when it encountered something it couldn't control." Anos's tone remained neutral. "What you become afterward is not my concern." The Watchtower shuddered one final time, structural supports giving way. Emergency systems blared warnings that no one remained to heed. Owlman stayed at his console as the station began its terminal descent toward Earth's atmosphere. He could have fled, could have sought survival, but survival without purpose felt hollow, and purpose had just been surgically removed from his existence. The strategist looked at Anos one final time. "Will you tell them, the heroes, that you saved their world?" "I did not save it." Anos began to fade, presence withdrawing from the dying station. I removed a corruption. What grows in its place is their responsibility. Alman nodded, accepting. Then at least you're honest. Unknowns disappeared without response, leaving the strategist alone on the bridge of a station that would burn on re-entry within minutes. Alman looked at his screens, dark now, reflecting only his own face. Pulled up calculations, one final time running scenarios for a universe where crime syndicate existed, but didn't matter where strength remained, but dominance became optional, where he persisted as intellect without authority. The math was bleak. But math had always been bleak. That's why he'd found it beautiful. The watchtower entered atmosphere heat building against hull plating designed for short re-entries, not prolonged descent. Metal began to glow, then melt, then tear away in burning chunks that streaked across the sky like falling stars. On Prime Earth, in what remained of Metropolis, Lex Luthor stood amid rubble, watching those meteors fall. Crime Syndicate's headquarters dying. Justice League scattered but alive, the city damaged but standing. Around him, survivors emerged from shelters, staring at skies that had been filled with drones and threats for days now, showing only clouds and falling debris. Someone had won. Something had intervened. The world had been saved by a force nobody understood, operating on principles nobody could articulate. Leaving consequences nobody knew how to process. Lex watched the last pieces of the watchtower burn away to nothing, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that the intervention had been mercy and judgment simultaneously. Crime Syndicate hadn't been destroyed. They'd been dismissed, made irrelevant, rendered unable to function as they had. Worse than death, better than victory. He thought about the figure he'd glimpsed in surveillance footage before systems went dark, someone moving through the chaos with purpose that felt inevitable rather than heroic. Someone who'd erased a threat not by fighting it, but by removing the conditions that made it possible. Lex Luthor looked at the sky, at the city, at the people beginning to realize they'd survived something they didn't understand. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. We were saved. Or warned. The question hung in the air unanswered and unanswerable as Prime Earth began the long process of rebuilding from invasion that had ended not with a bang, but with silent, comprehensive erasure of purpose. And somewhere already gone, already moving beyond this world's concerns. Anno's Voldigoad walked toward the next system that required judgment. The Crime Syndicate's tyranny was over, not because heroes defeated villains, not because good triumphed over evil, but because a system built on domination had encountered something that simply refused to permit its continued existence, and in refusing had made that existence impossible. So, Chapter 8 is the big finale, and it honestly starts in the most casual way possible. The Justice League just falls out of the sky like broken toys, and Anos doesn't even make a big deal out of it. He just tweaks their gravity real quick so they don't hit the ground and turn into pancakes. That's it. That's him saving them. Well, bare minimum, but at least it works. And then things really start to get wild, because Anos pulls out Venus de Noah. Owlman thinks, okay, this is it, the world's about to end. But that's not what happens at all. Instead of destroying the planet, Anos just cuts the idea of tyranny out of existence. Like he doesn't kill anyone. He just deletes the rule that says if you're strong, you automatically get to be in charge. And you can see how fast that hits them. Ultraman is still standing there with all his power, but now he's got nothing to fight for. He realizes that punching things doesn't make him king anymore, so he just stops. Then you've got Volthoom, and watching him straight up quit being a cursed ring is honestly hilarious. The bond breaks, and suddenly he's like, yeah, I'm out, because there's nothing left tying him to anyone. And here's what I really think is happening. Well, Anos didn't just beat them. He punished them in a way that's way worse than death. He forces them to keep existing without the belief system that gave them meaning in the first place. They're basically stuck as leftovers of a dead philosophy, and Owlman realizes that immediately. That's why Owlman decides to ride the exploding watchtower all the way down. It's not even about drama anymore. He just knows he's done. He's obsolete. And honestly, my bullshit final take is that Lex Luthor, watching all this go down, is probably realizing for once in his life that he's not the smartest guy in the room. Thanos treated a whole alien invasion like a typo in a document, fixed it in seconds, and didn't even wait around for a damn thank you. Ha ha. Alright, see y'all in the next story.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.